The shuttle descended through the clouds of Kesher Prime, and Valera of House Calith pressed her face against the cold glass to watch the sprawling diplomatic station come into view below her. It was a massive ring of metal and glass floating above the neutral world, home to 1,000 species and 10,000 secrets. And now it would be her home as well, her prison, perhaps. Depending on how one chose to see it, she was tall for a silvery female, with skin the color of pale moonlight and eyes that shifted between violet and silver, depending on her mood. Her people were known throughout the galaxy as diplomats and scholars, beings of culture and refinement who had long ago traded war for words. They valued loud voices and bold declarations. And a Siltheri who could not command a room with speech was considered barely worth noticing at all today. She wore the ceremonial robes of a bride, silver threads woven through dark fabric that flowed like water around her slender form. Today she would meet the human male she had been assigned to marry, a political union meant to seal the fragile peace between the Siltheri Dominion and the Terran Coalition. She had seen his file, read his name, studied his photograph, Daniel Mercer. Age 34 by Earth years, former military serviceman, current diplomatic attacheth. File told her almost nothing useful. Her mother had warned her about humans before she left home, speaking in that sharp whisper she used when she wanted to frighten her children into obedience. Humans were dangerous, she said, evolved on a death world filled with predators and poisons and disasters that would kill any sensible species. They were persistence hunters who chased their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. And they carried that relentless nature into everything they did. Their wars, their expansion across the stars, their refusal to know when they were beaten. But her mother had also said that humans could be managed if one was clever enough. And Valera had always been clever. The shuttle landed with a gentle bump, and a Siltheri attendant opened the door for her with a low bow. Valera stepped onto the metal platform and drew a deep breath of recycled station air, already missing the sweet winds of her homeworld. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin and reminded herself that she was doing this for her people, for the Alliance, for peace, not for herself. Never for herself. A small delegation waited for her at the end of the platform. She recognized the Terran ambassador, a plump woman with gray hair and kind eyes who smiled too much for Siltheri comfort. Beside her stood several human officials in dark suits, their faces professionally blank. And at the back of the group, almost hidden in shadow, stood a man who did not smile at all. Daniel Mercer. He was tall for a human, lean and straight-backed, with short, dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a simple black suit without medals or decorations, and his hands hung loose at his sides in a way that struck Valera as odd. Siltheri males would have been puffing out their chests and practicing their introductory speeches, but this human just stood there, watching her approach with an expression she could not read. The ambassador stepped forward and launched into a lengthy greeting full of diplomatic pleasantries, and Valera responded with the appropriate words in the appropriate tone while her eyes kept drifting back to the silent man at the back. When the formalities were finally complete, Daniel Mercer walked forward and stopped exactly 2 paces in front of her, close enough to speak, far enough to show respect. Valera of House Calith, he said, and his voice was quiet, almost soft. I am honored to meet you. That was all. No flowery declarations, no boasts about his family lineage, no promises of devotion or protection. Just 8 words delivered in a tone so calm it bordered on flat. Valera waited for him to continue, but he simply stood there, his gray eyes steady on her face. Waiting for her response, she felt a flicker of irritation. Was this human mocking her with his silence, or was he simply too dim to know how a proper greeting should unfold? The honor is mine, she replied carefully, keeping her voice neutral. I look forward to our union and the bond it will create between our peoples. Daniel nodded once, and something that might have been approval crossed his features for just a moment before vanishing. "I will do my best to be a good husband," he said. "If you need anything, you only have to ask." And then he stepped back and let the ambassador guide Valera away from more meetings and more ceremonies. And she did not speak to him again until their wedding 3 days later. The wedding itself was a strange affair. A blend of Silthery tradition and human custom that left both sides slightly uncomfortable. Valera wore white as humans preferred, but the fabric was woven with Silthery blessing threads. Daniel wore a dark suit with a single silver pin on his lapel that matched the color of her eyes. The vows were spoken in both languages, promises of partnership and mutual respect that carried the weight of interstellar politics behind every word when it was over. They were led to their shared quarters in the diplomatic wing of the station, a spacious apartment with separate bedrooms, a common area filled with gifts from well-wishers, and a window that looked out over the stars. Valera stood at that window for a long time after the guests departed, watching the distant lights and wondering what she had gotten herself into. Daniel moved through the apartment behind her, putting away gifts and straightening furniture with quiet efficiency. He did not try to make conversation, did not ask how she was feeling, did not do any of the things a Silthery husband would have done on his wedding night. He simply worked in silence until everything was in order. And then he paused by the door to his bedroom. "Good night, Valera," he said. "Sleep well." She turned to look at him, the strange human she had just married, and she searched his face for some hint of what he was thinking. But his expression was as unreadable as it had been on the landing platform. Calm and patient and utterly closed. "Good night, Daniel," she replied. He nodded once and disappeared into his room. And Valera was left alone with the stars and her confusion in the weeks that followed. She learned more about her husband through observation than conversation. He woke early every morning and exercised in the small training room attached to their quarters, moving through routines that looked like dancing but felt like something else entirely. He prepared meals for both of them without being asked, simple food that was surprisingly good. He read constantly, old books from Earth loaded onto a battered tablet he carried everywhere. He spoke to her politely when she spoke to him first, answered her questions with short but accurate responses, and never once raised his voice in frustration or joy. He was like a ghost haunting her life. Present, but somehow not quite there, her family called regularly, hungry for gossip about her human husband, and Valera found herself struggling to describe him. He was not cruel, not unkind, not demanding, but he was not warm either, not affectionate, not anything she knew how to understand. Her cousin Theron laughed when she admitted her confusion, his face bright with mockery on the screen. "Perhaps you received a defective one," he said. "Perhaps this human is broken or stupid or both. I told you the stories about them were exaggerated." Valera did not argue with him. But late that night, she found herself watching Daniel through the crack of his bedroom door. He sat on the edge of his bed, holding something small and dark in his hands, and for just a moment, she saw something cross his face, something deep and sad and old, before he noticed her presence and the mask returned. "Can I help you with something?" he asked calmly. "No," she said quickly, stepping back. "I was just no." She retreated to her own room and lay awake for hours, thinking about that flash of emotion she had glimpsed, wondering what secrets her silent husband carried behind those gray eyes, and whether she would ever know him at all. 3 months passed on Kesher Prime, and Valera settled into a rhythm she had not expected. She rose each morning to find breakfast waiting on the table, prepared by hands that never seemed to rest. She attended council meetings and diplomatic functions throughout the day, negotiating trade agreements and cultural exchanges with a skill that earned her respect among her peers. And each evening she returned to their quarters to find Daniel already there, reading his old books or staring out the window at the stars with that distant look in his eyes. She began to notice things about him that she had missed before it. started with the way he moved through crowded rooms. Silvery males pushed forward and demanded attention. But Daniel did the opposite. He drifted along the edges, staying out of sight, positioning himself in corners where he could see every entrance and exit at once. At first, she thought it was shyness or perhaps discomfort with alien company. But the more she watched, the more she realized it was something else. He was not hiding from attention, but scanning for threats. Watching every face and every hand with eyes that missed nothing. Then there were the scars. She glimpsed them one morning when he came out of the training room. His shirt damp with sweat and clinging to his skin. Thin white lines crossed his forearms like old maps, and a larger mark curved along his ribs, ragged at the edges as if something had tried to tear him open. He caught her staring and calmly pulled on a fresh shirt, covering the evidence without comment, and she was too startled to ask. Her curiosity grew like a hunger she could not satisfy. Who was this man she had married, and what had made him the way he was? One evening she found the courage to ask him directly. They were sitting in the common area, Daniel reading on his tablet, and Valera pretending to review diplomatic reports while stealing glances at him. Finally, she set down her work and cleared her throat, and he looked up with that patient expression he always wore. "Daniel," she said, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. What did you do before this?" "In the Terran military. What was your job?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face as if measuring how much truth she could handle. Then he set down his tablet and folded his hands in his lap. "I kept people safe," he said. "That is not an answer. It is the only answer I can give you." She wanted to push harder, to demand details and explanations, but something in his tone warned her that she was approaching a door he did not want opened. So she nodded and changed the subject, and the moment passed, but she did not forget. The other Silthri on the station had strong opinions about her human husband at a reception hosted by the Kreth delegation. Valera found herself surrounded by members of her own species, their elegant faces twisted with curiosity and barely hidden contempt. They asked about Daniel's family and his achievements and his plans for the future, and when she could not provide satisfactory answers, they exchanged knowing looks. Her cousin Theron was the worst of them. He had traveled to Kesha Prime as part of a trade mission, and he took every opportunity to mock her marriage. At the reception, he stood beside her with a glass of wine in his hand, watching Daniel stand alone in a corner across the room. "Look at him," Theron said, his voice dripping with amusement. "He has been standing there for an hour without speaking to anyone. Is he even capable of conversation, or did the humans send you a mute?" "He speaks when he has something to say," Valera replied. "Perhaps you could learn from his example." Theron laughed as if she had made a joke. "The great human warriors we hear so much about, where is the fire? Where is the fury? Your husband looks like he could not frighten a child, let alone an enemy. I think the stories about humans are nothing but propaganda designed to make weaker species respect them." Valera opened her mouth to respond, but she stopped when she noticed Daniel looking in their direction. He was too far away to hear the conversation, but his eyes moved between her face and Theron's with an expression she had not seen before, cold and calculating, like a predator assessing a potential threat. Then the moment passed, and he returned to his quiet observation of the room, and Valera shivered without knowing why that night she asked him another question. "Daniel, do you ever get angry?" He looked up from his book with a slight frown. "Why do you ask?" "I have never seen you raise your voice or lose your temper. My cousin said terrible things about you tonight, and you just stood there watching. Does nothing make you angry?" He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I used to be very angry," he said. "When I was young, when I first joined the service, I burned with it. I thought anger made me strong, made me brave, made me dangerous. But I learned that anger is a fire that destroys everything it touches, including the person who carries it. So I learned to set it aside, to keep it locked away where it cannot hurt anyone. But it is still there, Valera said. Inside you somewhere. He met her eyes. And for just a moment she saw a flicker of something vast and dark behind his calm expression, a glimpse of the fire he had described. Banked but not extinguished. Yes, he said simply. It is still there. She found that she believed him as the weeks continued. She noticed more small things that painted a picture she was only beginning to understand. Daniel always walked on the side of her closest to potential danger. He could name every person who entered their quarters and remember details about their species and their body language days later. He never sat with his back to a door. And sometimes, late at night, she heard him moving through the apartment in the darkness, checking locks and windows with the silent efficiency of long practice. One morning she woke early and went to the training room to find him. He was moving through a series of forms with his eyes closed, his body flowing from position to position like water following an invisible path. His hands formed shapes. She did not recognize strikes and blocks and holds that looked almost gentle but carried a weight. She could sense even from the doorway she watched for nearly an hour before he finished. When he opened his eyes and saw her standing there, he showed no surprise. "Good morning," he said. "Would you like breakfast?" "What was that?" she asked. "That training, those movements, what were they?" He picked up a towel and wiped the sweat from his face. "Old things," he said. "Techniques my teachers taught me a long time ago. They helped me stay focused. They look like fighting techniques. They can be," he admitted. "But they are also a form of meditation. A way to keep the body sharp and the mind calm. Would you like me to teach you some basic movements?" She almost said yes, but something held her back, a feeling that learning those movements would be like stepping through a door she could never close again. So she shook her head and made an excuse about council meetings. And the moment passed, but she kept watching him, kept gathering pieces of the puzzle, kept trying to understand the quiet human who shared her life. And then the alarms started screaming, and everything she thought she knew about Daniel Mercer was shattered in a single terrible night. The attack came without warning on a quiet evening when the station was settling into its night cycle. Valera was in the council chamber, reviewing trade proposals when the lights flickered and turned red, and a sound she had never heard before cut through the air, a piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising and falling like the scream of some wounded beast. Around her, the other diplomats rose from their seats in confusion, their voices blending into a chaos of questions no one could answer. Then the explosions began. The floor shook beneath her feet, and she grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. Through the windows, she could see flashes of light in the distance, plasma fire blooming against the station's hull like deadly flowers. The emergency broadcast crackled to life, spitting warnings in a dozen languages. Breach in the eastern docking ring. Hostile forces boarding. All personnel seek shelter immediately. Varax, someone whispered, and the words spread through the chamber like a disease. Vela felt her blood turn cold. She had heard stories about the Varax her entire life. Tales of the insectoid raiders who swept through the galaxy, taking slaves and leaving death in their wake. They were creatures of nightmare, standing twice as tall as most humanoids, with armored shells and mandibles that could crush bone. They feared nothing and respected no treaties. And wherever they went, suffering followed. The silvery guards rushed to seal the chamber doors, their hands shaking as they worked the controls. Around her, the other diplomats huddled together, their faces pale with terror. Valera found herself searching the room for her husband, wondering if he had been caught in the attack, wondering if he was already dead. And then he was there beside her, appearing so suddenly she gasped. "Stay close to me," Daniel said, and his voice was different somehow, harder and colder than she had ever heard it. Stay behind me and do not run unless I tell you to run. Do you understand?" She nodded. Too startled to speak, he reached beneath his coat and drew something from a hidden sheath at his back. A long curved blade of dark metal that caught the red emergency lights and gleamed like something alive. It was a sword of a type she had never seen. Elegant and deadly, with a single edge that looked sharp enough to cut through stone. "What is that?" She breathed. "Something I hoped I would never need again." He replied. The doors buckled. The Varax came through in a wave of chitinous armor and clicking mandibles. Their weapons spitting plasma fire that scorched the walls and sent diplomats diving for cover. They were even more terrifying than the stories had described. Towering monsters with 4 arms and eyes that glittered with cruel intelligence. They moved with impossible speed for creatures so large. Spreading through the chamber like a plague, the silvery guards fired their sidearms, but the shots bounced harmlessly off the Varax armor. One by one the guards fell, cut down by plasma bolts or torn apart by razor-sharp claws. The screaming filled Valera's ears. The smell of burning flesh filled her nose, and she thought with terrible certainty that she was about to die. Then Daniel stepped forward. He moved like nothing she had ever seen, like something from the oldest legends of her people, not walking but flowing. His blade singing through the air in arcs of silver light. The first Varax to reach him died before it even saw the strike, its head separating from its body in a spray of violet blood. The second fell a heartbeat later, its weapon arm severed at the joint. The third and fourth came at him together, and he danced between them like a shadow, his sword finding gaps in their armor with impossible precision. Vala could not look away. He had watched silvery duelists perform their elegant battles, had seen Kreth gladiators clash in the fighting pits, had studied combat footage from a dozen wars, but she had never witnessed anything like this. Daniel did not fight like a soldier following orders. He fought like a force of nature, inevitable and unstoppable, each movement flowing into the next with a terrible grace that turned violence into something almost beautiful, and all the while his face remained calm. His gray eyes cold and focused, his breathing steady as if he were simply walking through a garden on a peaceful afternoon. 5 Varax fell, then 7, then 10. The remaining raiders finally seemed to understand what they were facing. They pulled back toward the broken doors, their confidence shattered, their mandibles clicking in what might have been fear. One of them raised a plasma rifle and aimed at Daniel's chest, but he was already moving, sliding beneath the shot and closing the distance in a single fluid stride. His blade took the creature's hands at the wrists, and a second stroke opened his throat before it could scream. 12 Varax had entered that chamber. 12 Varax lay dead on the floor. Daniel stood among the bodies, his blade dripping violet blood, his chest rising and falling with breaths that were only slightly faster than normal. He turned slowly, scanning the room for additional threats, and when he found none, he began to clean his sword with a cloth he pulled from his pocket. The same calm, methodical movement she had seen him use when washing dishes or folding laundry. The surviving diplomat stared at him in stunned silence. Valera found her voice at last. "Daniel," she said, and her voice came out as a whisper. He looked at her, and for just a moment she saw something behind the cold mask, something that might have been pain or regret or the ghost of the anger he had locked away so long ago. "Are you hurt?" "Yes," she shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. He nodded once and turned back toward the door, his blade held ready. "Stay here," he said. "I am going to make sure the corridor is clear." He vanished into the smoke and darkness beyond the chamber, and Valera sank to the floor with her back against the wall, her heart's pounding so hard she thought they might burst. Around her, the other survivors were weeping and praying and calling for help, but she just sat there staring at the place where her husband had disappeared, trying to understand what she had just witnessed the battle for the station lasted until dawn. Terran Marines arrived to reinforce the defenders. And together they pushed the Varax back to their ships and drove them into the void. The cost was terrible: hundreds dead, thousands wounded, entire sections of the station left in ruins. But the raid had failed, and the survivors would rebuild Valera. Did not see Daniel again until late the next morning. She found him in their quarters, sitting by the window with his blade across his knees. He had cleaned himself up, but she could still see traces of violet blood beneath his fingernails and a fresh bruise darkening along his jaw. He looked tired in a way she had never seen before, tired in a way that went deeper than muscles and bones. "You should be resting," she said. "I cannot sleep," he replied. "Not yet. Not while I can still see their faces." She crossed the room and sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. For a long time, neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the distant hum of the station's damaged systems struggling to repair themselves. "You killed them all," Valera said finally. 12 of them, with nothing but that sword. "I have never seen anything like it." Daniel did not look at her. "I told you once that I kept people safe," he said. "This is how I did it. This is what I was trained to be. A weapon in human form, designed to destroy anything that threatened innocent lives. Why did you never tell me?" "Because I wanted to be more than that," he said, and his voice cracked for the first time since she had known him. "Because I thought if I was quiet enough, gentle enough, maybe I could forget what my hands have done. Maybe I could be a person instead of a monster." Valera reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm and the strength in his fingers. "You are not a monster," she said. "You saved everyone in that chamber. You saved me." He finally turned to look at her, and she saw the sorrow in his gray eyes, the weight of every life he had taken, pressing down on him like a physical burden. "I do not know what I am anymore," he admitted. She squeezed his hand. "Then let me help you figure it out." The days after the attack were filled with chaos and grief. Valera threw herself into the work of recovery, organizing relief efforts and coordinating with the other delegations to restore order to the damaged station. She worked from dawn until long past midnight, pushing herself to exhaustion because the alternative was sitting still and thinking about what she had witnessed. In that council chamber, the blood and the screaming and the terrible beauty of her husband's violence, Daniel stayed in their quarters, emerging only when she asked him to accompany her to official functions. He was quieter than ever, if such a thing were possible, spending long hours staring out the window or sitting with his eyes closed in meditation. She knew he was struggling with something she could not fully understand, wrestling with demons that had nothing to do with the Varax and everything to do with himself. 1 week after the attack, she came home early and found him holding his sword. He sat on the floor of the common room with the blade laid across his knees, the same position she had seen him in that first morning. His eyes were open but distant, focused on something far away, and he did not seem to notice when she entered the room. She sat down across from him and waited after. A long silence. He began to speak, and his voice was soft and tired and full of pain. "When I was 18 years old, I joined the Terran Colonial Defense Force," he said. "I was angry and restless and looking for a purpose, and the recruiters promised me I would find one. They sent me to a training facility on the edge of known space, a place that did not officially exist. And there they taught me things that are not included in any military manual." Valera listened without interrupting. "The program was called the Night Watch." Daniel continued. "We were selected for certain traits: physical ability, mental resilience, emotional control, and then we were reshaped into something new. They taught us to fight in ways most species have forgotten. Close combat techniques designed to work when technology fails. They taught us to move in silence, to survive in any environment, to kill without hesitation and without mercy." He ran his fingers along the flat of the blade. his touch almost reverent. This sword was given to me by my instructor, a man named Henry Cole, who had carried it through 3 wars before me. He told me it was called katana, a weapon from old Earth, from a culture that understood the weight of taking life. He said that a blade like this demands respect, demands honor, demands that the one who wields it accepts responsibility for every death. And you have carried it ever since. Valera said, "For 15 years, Daniel replied. Through the border wars, through the colony raids, through missions so classified that even the people who ordered them pretend they never happened. I have used this blade to kill enemies of humanity in numbers I stopped counting long ago, because counting would drive me mad." His gray eyes finally focused on her face, and she saw the depth of his exhaustion. "I have nightmares," he admitted. "Every night since I was 22 years old, I close my eyes and see the faces of the beings I have killed. Some of them were monsters, like the Varax, creatures that deserve death. But some of them were just soldiers following orders, or frightened civilians caught in the wrong place, or enemies who might have been friends in a different universe." Valera felt her heart's ache for him. "Why did you leave? Why did you take this marriage assignment?" "Because I could not do it anymore," he said. "Because the anger that had kept me going for so long finally burned itself out, and I realized I had become the very thing I was supposed to be fighting against. I went to my commanders and told them I was finished, and they gave me a choice: disappear quietly into obscurity, or be eliminated as a security risk. They threatened to kill you?" "They did not need to threaten," Daniel said. "I understood the situation perfectly. Men like me are not allowed to exist outside the program. We know too much, we have done too much, and we represent a danger to the clean image the Coalition wants to project. The diplomatic marriage was my way out, my chance to become invisible, to be nobody, to let the killer inside me fade away while I pretended to be something harmless." He set the sword aside and looked at her with something close to desperation. "I never wanted you to see what I am," he said. "I wanted to be better for you, to be the quiet husband who makes breakfast and reads books and never raises his voice. I wanted to prove that I could be gentle, but the violence inside me did not have to define who I am." Valera moved closer to him, close enough to touch. "You protected me," she said. "You protected everyone in that chamber when no one else could. How can that be anything but good?" "Because I enjoyed it," Daniel whispered, and shame twisted his features. "When I drew my blade and faced those Varax, part of me was glad. Part of me had been waiting for an excuse to let the monster out of its cage. And when it was over, and they were all dead, that part of me was satisfied in a way I cannot describe." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Listen to me, Daniel Mercer. I do not know much about humans or their strange death world, or the fire that burns inside them. But I know this: you had the power to become a tyrant, a murderer, a beast that kills for pleasure. And instead you chose to become a protector. You chose to use your violence in service of others. You chose to lock away the monster and be gentle when you could have been cruel." Tears gathered in his gray eyes. "That does not erase what I have done." "No," she agreed. "Nothing can erase the past. But you are not your past, Daniel. You are the choices you make today, tomorrow, and every day after that. And every day I've known you, you have chosen kindness." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he did something she had never seen him do before. He let out a shaky breath and allowed himself to cry. Silent tears rolling down his cheeks while his shoulders trembled with the weight of 15 years of grief. Valera held him until the tears stopped. And then she held him longer, and somewhere in that quiet moment she realized that her feelings for this human had changed without her noticing. He was no longer just a political obligation, a stranger she shared quarters with, a puzzle she was trying to solve. He was her husband, and she was starting to love him when he finally pulled away. His eyes were red, but his expression was steadier than it had been in days. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For seeing me," he replied. "Not the weapon, not the killer, not the silent ghost who haunts your apartment, but me." She smiled, and it felt like the first real smile she had offered him since their wedding day. "I think I am only beginning to see you, Daniel. There is so much more to learn." "We have time," he said. "Yes," she agreed, and the word felt like a promise. "We have time." That night they sat together by the window and watched the stars. And for the first time, Daniel told her about Earth, not the death world statistics or the persistence predator evolution, but the beauty of it. He described forests filled with ancient trees and oceans that stretched beyond the horizon. He told her about mountains that touched the clouds and deserts that burned like fire, and cities filled with millions of humans living together in controlled chaos. He told her about the samurai, the warriors who had carried blades like his 1,000 years ago, who lived by codes of honor and silence and accepted the responsibility of violence as a sacred duty. He told her why the sword mattered, why he could not simply throw it away, because it represented the best parts of what he had been, the parts that fought for something greater than himself. And Valera listened and learned and began to understand that she had married something extraordinary. The footage spread through the station within hours of the attack, and from there it spread across the sector. And from there it spread to every corner of the known galaxy. Someone had been recording when the Varax breached the council chamber doors, capturing the chaos and the terror and the helpless screaming of the diplomats. And then the camera had turned, almost by accident, to catch the silent human who stepped into the path of the monsters. The video was not high quality, grainy and shaking from the trembling hands that held the device, but it showed enough. It showed Daniel Mercer move through 12 armored Varax raiders like a blade through water, cutting them down one after another with a weapon most species had abandoned centuries ago. It showed the calm on his face and the precision of his movements and the terrible efficiency of a human who had been trained to kill. The Terran Coalition tried to suppress the footage, but it was already too late. Billions of beings across 100 worlds had watched it, shared it, whispered about it in the dark. The legend of the silent human had begun. Valera felt the change in the way others looked at her husband. Diplomatic functions the representatives of other species gave. Daniel wide berth. Daniel wide berth. Their conversations dying to whispers when he entered a room. The Kreth ambassadors, famous for their warrior culture and aggressive negotiating tactics, treated him with elaborate courtesy that bordered on fear. Even the Silthery delegates looked at him differently now. Their mockery replaced by a cautious respect that grated on Valera's nerves. Her cousin Theron had returned to the homeworld immediately after the attack, and he had not contacted her since. She suspected he was embarrassed, or perhaps genuinely frightened, by how wrong his assessment of her husband had been. Daniel himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He withdrew further into silence, spent more time in their quarters, and spoke even less than before at public events. When Valera asked him about it, he simply shrugged. "I do not want to be famous," he said. "I do not want to be feared. I just want to live quietly and be left alone. That may not be possible anymore." She replied, "I know," he said, and there was sadness in his voice. "I knew at the moment I drew my blade. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, but something else had changed too. Something private between the two of them that had nothing to do with fame or legends or the opinions of other species. They began to talk, not just the polite exchanges of roommates sharing space, but real conversations that stretched into the small hours of the night. Daniel told her about his childhood in a small town on Earth, about his mother who taught him to cook, and his father who taught him to be silent and strong. Valera told him about her own family, about the expectations that had shaped her, and the rebellion that had led her to accept a political marriage just to escape. They discovered that they both loved to read. Though their tastes differed wildly, she preferred diplomatic histories and political theories, while he gravitated toward poetry and philosophy and old stories about heroes and monsters. They began to recommend books to each other, and soon the apartment was filled with tablets loaded with texts from both their worlds. Daniel started teaching her the basic forms of his morning training, the slow movements that built strength and focus and calm. She was not a natural fighter, and she knew she would never wield a blade like he did. But there was something meditative about the practice that helped quiet her racing thoughts, and slowly, so slowly she almost missed it happening, they began to build something that neither of them had expected: love, not the passionate romance of silvery poetry, all grand declarations and dramatic gestures. This was something quieter, something that grew in the spaces between words, in the warmth of a hand held in the darkness, in the comfort of knowing that someone was there. The alliance between the Silthery Dominion and the Terran Coalition strengthened. In the years that followed, Valeria was promoted to senior ambassador, given responsibility for the most important negotiations of the decade. She traveled across the sector, brokering deals and resolving conflicts that had seemed impossible. And everywhere she went, Daniel accompanied her, quiet, watchful, always positioned between her and potential danger. They never had to face another attack like the one on Kesher Prime. But there were moments when enemies tested the boundaries. Pirates who thought a diplomatic vessel would be easy prey. Warlords who believed they could intimidate a Silthery negotiator into unfavorable terms. Criminal organizations that mistook silence for weakness. Each time, something would happen that reminded the galaxy why it was unwise to threaten what a human had chosen to protect: a pirate captain who tried to board their ship was found unconscious outside an airlock with a broken arm and a very clear memory of gray eyes and a dark blade. A warlord who made threatening gestures at a negotiation table suddenly discovered that the quiet human in the corner had somehow moved close enough to whisper in his ear without anyone seeing him move. A criminal syndicate that attempted to kidnap. Valeria found 3 of their best operatives returned to them alive, but deeply traumatized. Refusing to speak about what had happened, the rumors grew with each incident, morphing and expanding until they barely resembled the truth. Some said Daniel Mercer was a demon from Earth's ancient legends, summoned to protect his wife. Others claimed he was a machine, a weapon given human form by Terran engineers. A few insisted he was actually dozens of identical humans working in shifts. Because no single being could be everywhere at once, Daniel ignored the rumors. As he ignored most things that didn't directly affect his duty, but Valeria noticed the way he smiled sometimes when he heard a particularly ridiculous story, the corners of his mouth twitching upward before he caught himself and returned to his usual calm. She began to suspect that somewhere beneath the scars and the silence and the weight of his past, her husband had a sense of humor he kept carefully hidden. One evening, many years after their wedding, she found him standing at the window of their quarters on a new station orbiting a new world. The stars spread out before him like diamonds scattered across black velvet, and his reflection in the glass showed a face that had grown more aligned with age, but no less strong. She came to stand beside him, and they watched the stars together in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked finally. "The marriage, the life we have built, do you ever wish you had chosen differently?" Daniel turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were soft in a way they had never been on their wedding day. "I spent 15 years as a weapon," he said. "I killed and killed and killed, and I thought that was all I would ever be. But then I married a Silthery diplomat who was too stubborn to leave me alone, who kept asking questions and demanding answers, who refused to accept my silence as the end of the conversation." He reached out and took her hand, his scarred fingers intertwining with her pale ones. "You gave me a reason to be more than what they made me," he continued. "You showed me that I could be gentle without being weak, that I could be quiet without being empty, that I could carry the weight of my past without letting it crush me. I do not regret a single moment of our life together. Valera felt tears prick at her eyes. I was so afraid of you in the beginning, she admitted. Afraid and confused and certain that I had made a terrible mistake. And now? She smiled. Now I cannot imagine my life without you. He pulled her close, and they stood together at the window. Two beings from different worlds who had found something precious in each other. Far below them, on the planet's surface, the representatives of a dozen species were gathering for a peace summit that would reshape the balance of power in the sector. There would be challenges ahead, threats to face, enemies who thought they could tear apart what had been built, but Valera was not afraid. She had her husband beside her. Her silent human with his quiet strength and his terrible blade. And she had learned the truth that the galaxy was only beginning to understand humans were not the simple creatures other species imagined them to be. They were not merely persistent predators or death world survivors or walking weapons. They were beings of contradiction and depth, capable of unimaginable violence and equally unimaginable tenderness. They could be monsters or heroes, depending on what was asked of them. And the ones who loved them could trust them with their lives to not mistake their silence for weakness, to not assume their gentleness means they cannot fight, and never, ever threaten what a human has chosen to protect, because when you do, when you force them to draw their blades, you will discover too late what the Varax learned in that council chamber on Kesher Prime, that some doors, once opened, release something ancient and powerful and utterly without mercy, and nothing in all the stars will save you